There are two kinds of relationships in the history of rock music. There are the ones that produce something, a song, a tour, a creative partnership that left a record in the world. And there are the ones that produced nothing you can point to, that existed entirely in the private space between two people, and that are visible now only in the fragments left behind by the people who were present at their edges. The relationship between Freddie Mercury and David Bowie was both of these things simultaneously. It produced Under Pressure, one of the most recognizable songs of the 20th century, recorded in a single extended session in Montreux in the summer of 1981 and released that October. And it produced something else, something that has no title and no release date and no official record of any kind, that existed in the 72 hours surrounding that recording and in the years that followed, and that has been reconstructed from fragments across 4 decades of interviews and accounts and careful oblique descriptions by the people who were close enough to both men to know that what happened between them was significant and private enough to protect. This story is about both kinds, the one that was released and the one that was not. David Bowie and Freddie Mercury were aware of each other long before they were in the same room. In the early 1970s, when both men were in the process of constructing the public personas that would define their careers, they were operating in adjacent but distinct spaces of British popular music. Bowie with the Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane albums, Queen with their first records and the growing reputation of their live performances. They had mutual acquaintances. They moved through overlapping social and industry worlds. But the specific quality of their awareness of each other was not that of contemporaries navigating the same market. It was something more considered than that, the specific attention that two people who understand exactly what each other is doing bring to observing each other from a distance. Bowie had watched Queen build their live reputation and had registered, without commenting publicly, what Freddie Mercury was doing on stage. Freddie had listened to Bowie's records with the ear of someone who understood the architecture of what was being attempted and who had formed views about it. By the time they were in the same room in Montreux in 1981, both men arrived already knowing more about the other than the casual familiarity of rock contemporaries would explain. The session that produced Under Pressure began, by all accounts, not as a planned collaboration, but as an organic extension of an evening that had started differently. Queen were recording in Mountain Studios in Montreux. David Bowie was in the city. There are various versions of what brought them together that night, the accounts of Brian May and Roger Taylor, given across various interviews over the decades, describe something between an accidental encounter and a deliberately casual invitation. The kind of thing that happens in a specific social world where proximity and opportunity and the late hour create conditions that more formal arrangements cannot. What is consistent across all the accounts is that by a certain point in the evening, Bowie and all 4 members of Queen were in the studio together, and that what began as informal playing became, across the hours that followed, something with its own shape and its own momentum and its own ending. The bass line that John Deacon played almost accidentally, the chord structure that emerged, the specific back and forth between two voices, one that had been Freddie Mercury's for a decade, and one that had been several people's, before settling into the voice that was David Bowie, at that moment finding the territory between them, and then discovering in that territory a song that neither of them had arrived intending to write. The making of Under Pressure was not easy in the ways that collaborations between two people of equivalent ego and equivalent artistic conviction are not easy. Both Bowie and Freddie Mercury had very clear ideas about what a piece of music should be and how it should get there, and those ideas did not always converge on the same destination. Brian May has described the session with a mixture of admiration and tactfulness that suggests the full story is considerably more textured than the official version. Roger Taylor has been less guarded in certain interviews, describing a creative tension between the two vocalists that was at times genuinely difficult, and that produced, in its resolution, something that neither of them would have produced separately. The specific point of friction, the question of who the song ultimately belonged to, of whose creative vision was being served, of how to distribute the control that both men naturally and legitimately claimed, is documented in fragments. What is documented more fully is the outcome, a song that both men were proud of and that represented a genuine fusion of two distinct artistic identities, rather than the absorption of one by the other. The resolution of that tension, in the hours before the recording was finalized, is part of the 72 hours this story is about. After the recording session was over, after the song existed, and the immediate creative work was done, Freddie Mercury and David Bowie did not separate. This is the part of the story that has been described most obliquely in the accounts that exist, and that requires the most careful reading of the fragments to reconstruct. What is known is that the two men spent time together in Montreux in the period following the Under Pressure session that went beyond the professional context of the recording. Bowie remained in the city. Freddie was there. The social world of Montreux at that time, the specific small community of musicians and creative people who were connected to Mountain Studios and to the particular character of the town in those years, was intimate enough that two men who had just spent a night making music together would naturally have continued in each other's company. What that company looked like, what was said, what was understood, what each man took from the other across those additional hours is the territory that has been protected across 40 years by the people who were close enough to observe it. The connection between Freddie Mercury and David Bowie that emerged from and extended beyond the Under Pressure session was not simply the professional relationship of two artists who had made something together and who maintained a collegial awareness of each other's work thereafter. People who knew both men during the years that followed have described something with more texture than that, a mutual recognition of a specific kind that is difficult to articulate without recourse to the inadequate language of influence or admiration. Both Bowie and Freddie Mercury were people who had constructed public identities of extraordinary deliberateness, who had understood, earlier than almost anyone else in popular music, that the persona was itself an artistic medium, and that its construction and management required the same intelligence and the same commitment as the music itself. They had arrived at this understanding by different routes and had executed it in entirely different ways, but the understanding was shared. And the recognition of a shared understanding between two people who have each arrived at it in isolation, who have each done the work alone, and who then encounter someone else who has done the same work from the other direction, produces a specific quality of connection that is unlike the recognition of a shared taste or a shared history. It is the recognition of a shared effort. And it is, in its way, one of the most private things two people can share. The 72 hours that this story names are not a single continuous event with a clear beginning and end. They are a frame, a way of marking the period around the Under Pressure session that contains something more than the professional record reflects. Within that frame, the recording itself, which lasted the better part of a night. The hours after the recording, in which two men who had just produced something extraordinary together existed in each other's company without the pressure of the work to structure the encounter. The specific conversations that took place about music, about the specific demands of being the kind of artists they both were, about the private costs of the public personas they had each constructed with such deliberateness, about the things that the performance of their respective identities required them to set aside, and whether there was any space in their lives where those things could exist without being set aside. These conversations are not documented. They exist now only in what the people who were present at the edges of them have been willing to imply, and in the quality of the relationship between the two men, in the years that followed, a relationship that was warmer and more specific and more privately held than the official record of their collaboration would suggest. What David Bowie saw in Freddie Mercury across those 72 hours was something he has described, in the careful language he brought to discussions of his peers, as uniqueness of a specific and non-transferable kind. Bowie was not given to easy admiration. He had been around enough extraordinary talent to have developed a calibrated sense of what constituted genuine singularity as opposed to exceptional skill, and he understood the difference. What Freddie Mercury had the specific quality of his relationship to performance, to an audience, to the act of giving himself completely to a room full of people, was not something that could be learned or improved upon or replicated. It was something he had arrived at through a combination of natural endowment and sustained development in the particular pressures of his specific life, and it was entirely his own. Bowie, who had spent his career constructing and deconstructing versions of himself with enormous intelligence and enormous craft, understood the value of something that could not be constructed, that simply was what it was, completely and without effort. He had seen it in very few people. He saw it in Freddie Mercury, and the specific form of respect that produces not admiration for achievement, but recognition of essence, is something that Bowie carried forward from those 72 hours, and that showed itself in the years that followed, in the specific and unguarded way he spoke about Freddie Mercury when the subject arose. What Freddie Mercury saw in David Bowie was a different and equally specific thing. Bowie represented, for Freddie, the proof that a particular kind of artistic ambition, the ambition to make popular music that was also genuinely strange, that refused the conventions of its form while remaining accessible, that took the audience somewhere they had not expected to go, was not only possible but sustainable across a long career. Freddie had always had this ambition. Queen, from their earliest records, had been attempting something that the music industry found difficult to categorize precisely because it refused to stay within any single genre or any single emotional register. Bowie had been doing the same thing for longer, with a consistency and a critical seriousness that Freddie respected enormously and that he had studied in his own way across the years. The specific conversations between them in Montreux, the ones that went beyond the technical and the professional, into the territory of what each man understood about the work they were both doing, were, by the accounts of people who have described their edges, conversations between equals in the specific and rare sense that both men understood exactly what the other was attempting and had formed genuine views about it. This is not common. Most conversations about music, even between gifted musicians, operate at a level of generality that prevents the kind of genuine exchange that Freddie and Bowie appear to have had across those hours in Montreux. The reason the 72 hours have been hidden, the reason this story has not been fully told in the 40 years since the Under Pressure session is not a single decision made by a single person for a single reason. It is the accumulated consequence of the privacy instincts of two men who were both, in very different ways, deeply protective of the boundary between their public and private selves. David Bowie's relationship to privacy was legendary. He was one of the most successfully private major celebrities of the 20th century, someone who had managed to maintain genuine areas of personal obscurity across a career of enormous public exposure by the simple method of never discussing them. Freddie Mercury's relationship to privacy was structurally identical, however different the specific things being protected. Both men had decided, early and consistently, that the performance was public and the person was not. The 72 hours in Montreux fell on the private side of that line, and the people who were close enough to observe fragments of it understood, without being told, that it was not theirs to share. When Freddie Mercury died on the 24th of November, 1991, David Bowie's response was not the conventional expression of loss that the public circumstances of a celebrity death tend to produce. He made statements, as was appropriate and as his relationship with Freddie warranted. He attended the Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley in April 1992, where he performed Heroes and then did something that very few people in that stadium fully understood in the moment he knelt on the stage and recited the Lord's Prayer in a gesture that was personal and strange and entirely unlike anything else in that concert's program, and that communicated a quality of grief that the official language of tribute could not contain. People who were present at Wembley that day and who knew something about the relationship between the two men understood that what Bowie was expressing was not the public grief of a colleague, but something more specific and more private. The grief of a person who has lost someone who saw them clearly and who they saw clearly in return, which is a rarer and more irreplaceable loss than the loss of a friend or a professional partner. The 1992 tribute concert performance has been analyzed many times in the decades since. What Bowie did on that stage, the specific choices he made, the Lord's Prayer, the quality of his presence in the moments between the songs, has been described variously as eccentric, as deeply felt, as a private communication in a public space. The most accurate reading for those who understand the context of what the two men had shared is that it was all three simultaneously. Bowie was performing his grief in the only language available to him in that setting, the language of public performance, and the performance was genuine in the way that his best work had always been genuine, rooted in something private and real, translated into a form that could be witnessed by 72,000 people without losing the essential quality of what it was expressing. He was saying goodbye to Freddie Mercury in public in the way that Freddie Mercury had always preferred his most important things to be said through the performance, through the work, through the specific act of giving everything you have in front of people who may not understand all of what they are receiving, but who will feel the weight of it regardless. David Bowie died on the 10th of January 2016, 2 days after the release of his final album, Black Star. He had known he was dying for 18 months and had made the album during that time in the full knowledge of what he was doing, constructing a farewell that was also a piece of art in the specific tradition of people who have made art out of everything else in their lives and who cannot stop making it even at the end. In the years between Freddie's death and his own, Bowie had spoken about Freddie in interviews with a consistency and a warmth that stood out from the way he spoke about almost anyone else. He had described him as one of the most unique people he had encountered. He had referenced the under pressure collaboration as one of the things he was proudest of. And in certain interviews, in certain moments, he had approached the edges of the 72 hours without ever quite stepping into them, gesturing towards something he was not going to describe, and that he clearly did not believe it was his place to describe. With his death in 2016, the last person who held the full version of the story from both sides is gone. What remains is the fragments, the accounts at the edges, the implications in the interviews, the quality of grief that Bowie expressed in 1992 and in the years that followed, and the song itself, which is the most public record of the 72 hours and which contains, for those who know how to listen to it, something of the private quality of what passed between the two men who made it. The reason this story is surfacing now 40 years after the Under Pressure session, 10 years after Bowie's death, more than 30 years after Freddie's, is not that new information has emerged. It is that enough time has passed for the fragments to be read together with the understanding that what they describe is more significant than any single account has suggested. The people who were at the edges of those 72 hours are now old enough and far enough from the events to speak about them with a greater degree of candor than the years immediately following either man's death permitted. The cultural distance from the events has grown to the point where the story can be told without feeling like a violation of the privacy that both men worked so hard to maintain. And the accumulated record, the interviews across 4 decades, the tribute concert performance, the specific and unguarded quality of Bowie's language when Freddie's name arose, the nature of Under Pressure itself has become rich enough that the shape of what happened is visible even without the full contents of the 72 hours being known. What Freddie Mercury and David Bowie shared across those hours in Montreux in 1981 was not a secret in the conventional sense, not information being withheld for strategic reasons, not a revelation that one party is protecting from the other. It was something closer to what any two people share when they recognize each other in the specific way that only a very few encounters produce. And when that recognition happens in a context private enough that neither of them has to manage the other's experience of it for the benefit of an audience. They were both at that moment in 1981 at the height of their respective powers. They were both beneath the enormous public constructions of their respective identities, people who had paid a specific and private price for those constructions and who understood in each other's company that the price was known and did not need to be explained. They made a song. They spent time together in the city by the lake. They went their separate ways and carried what had passed between them privately for the rest of their lives. And what has remained in the song, in the tribute concert, in the specific warmth of Bowie's language across 30 years of interviews, is the evidence of something that was real and that mattered in the way that things shared between people who truly see each other tend to matter. Long after the 72 hours were over. Long after both of them were gone.